This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 377, the Drupal State project. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about the Drupal State module with Brian Perry. Brian is a staff engineer at Pantheon working on open source projects in support of Pantheon's front-end sites product, and one of the foremost Nintendo experts in the Drupal community. Brian was a former guest host on episodes 282 through 285. Brian, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be back. Very exciting, and really glad that you took my Nintendo credits seriously in the intro.
Is that a newfound credit, Brian? I don't recall that in your previous appearances here on the show.
I think it's one of the new Acquia certifications. You can be certified as a Drupal Nintendo expert.
I'll have to look into that.
Well, I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Light Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, everyone. If you're watching the video, I apologize. My video looks a little strange as I'm squinting. Had a mishap with a twig in the eye over the weekend, and I'll be fine. I know. Thank you for your concern, but I look a little funny right now.
Would you say, John, that you're no longer a fan of Twig?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm probably okay. I have a newfound respect for it after it has maimed me.
Off to a great start.
The internet jokes are going to be plentiful with this one, I sense.
Also joining us, Leslie Glynn, Customer Success Manager at Redfin Solutions. Welcome back.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson Klutz, a Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. With the holidays fast approaching, I thought it'd be fun for us to talk about the Christmas Snow module, which adds a JavaScript snow effect to your website. It's actually originally created at the end of 2006 and was previously featured as module of the week back in episode number 78, which is almost exactly 8 years ago. Now, it has a new 2.0 version that was released earlier this year that supports Drupal 8, 9, and 10. And it has been, I would say, sporadically updated over the years, but definitely encouraging to see that recent release. It's currently in use by 84 websites, and the maintainer is of the who created the most recent release is Rohit Rajput. Apologies if I mispronounced your name, Rohit. He also maintains a jQuery Fireworks module. So if you're looking to add some JavaScript pizzazz to your website, there's a couple of options for you. Now, the Christmas Snow module creates a snowfall effect using a JavaScript library, but it also has built into the UI a variety of parameters you can use to sort of tweak the effect. So you can do things like set a max number of snowflakes that should be on the screen, what the color and size of the snowflakes should be, should the flakes follow the mouse, and sort of a few other options. But maybe we'll open up to the group. Has anyone either used this module recently or tried to do anything festive on a website they're working on?
I think I installed it when we first covered it 8 years ago. I love these little utility fun modules, but I don't think I'd ever actually put it on a client site purposefully. Although I'd love to find an excuse to get one of these on there, like for real. But no, I've never actually used it on a live site.
I feel like there's a whole subset here of like holiday related modules that we could spin up, right? So we have fireworks for the 4th of July and snow for our winter holidays, right? I don't know. I feel like maybe like an Easter egg hunt for Easter, maybe like, the Easter egg module, which I don't know, sounds a little ominous to me because, well, I'm sure Brian knows about Easter eggs, right? Playing a lot of video games. Plenty of those around.
I was going to say I'm an overuser of the JavaScript confetti package, which is definitely in the same neighborhood. There should probably be a Drupal version of that if there isn't.
So like you have a birthday party, you hit it with some confetti. Wow. All right.
I was just going to quickly add that there is also a pirate module for National Talk Like a Pirate Day. So,
I have seen that one. That one is
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have as well. Yep.
is useful.
yeah, and actually there is one other snowfall effect module for Drupal that's actually entirely CSS. So,
Oh, really?
actually options there for you.
What's that one? I'll have to check that one out. That's pretty cool.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but I can make sure it gets into the show notes.
Yeah, well,
Curious, are there any Halloween related modules out there?
Great question.
I feel like that's a
Not that I
big.
know.
I feel like that's a bit missing vertical right there.
That's right. Well, John, that's another module you can help us out with.
There you go. or the pumpkin spice module. I feel like that should be like everything has a pumpkin spice version. Like pumpkin spice Drupal is something we need to see happen.
So does this pumpkin spice turn on only when Starbucks has pumpkin spice on the menu or something? Like
it's pretty much like it's pretty much like an October through November sort of thing, I guess.
Or maybe you could like geolocate the nearest place you can get something that's pumpkin spice flavored.
I mean, the possibilities are endless.
That'd be a problem for you, John, though. It would be geolocating so many Dunkin' Donuts.
I actually have a Starbucks right down the road, so I also have the Dunkin' Donuts is closer, though, I will say.
I mean, that's true in New England all the time. Well, thank you, Martin. Appreciate your bringing a little festive mood to Module of the Week this week, and we'll see you next week. Okay, moving on to our updates and news. We have a few things today. Try to get through these. So the first thing is a non-Drupal thing. Dwarf Fortress, which is a game that I have been playing for many, many years. I think I first started in 2010-ish. Just had its release on Steam, so it's a little bit more accessible. If you like simulation games, it is the ultimate simulation. It kind of made the map of all those types of games. So check it out. It's a lot of fun, a little bit involved. It simulates it's the deepest simulation game on the internet. Also, want to give a shout out to one of our listeners. James Shield has made a Drupal advent calendar. So I think we're in day 6 right now. He's going through each day talking about a different project. He's featured, calendar views, talking Drupal itself. So check that out. It's in the Talking Drupal channel and the Drupal Slack. It's been, it's pretty well thought out. Nice little diversion. It's kind of like every day until Christmas, he's going to mention a project. And just really briefly, since this is coming out next Monday, Drupal 10 is expected this week. So we're pretty excited, looking forward to that. I don't know if you guys are. I've started, looking at the upgrade status module for a couple of sites, see what kind of work I need to do to get them ready for Drupal 10.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
You just gave me a good idea. I'm going to go do that on my personal website to see if I'm ready to upgrade to Drupal 10.
Okay, so before we jump into our primary topic, Brian, we saw you a couple weeks ago at NetCamp for our first back in-person camp in a few years. It was nice to see you there. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of NetCamp?
Yeah, it was great. It was definitely really great to be back in person. Since I'm from the area, it's always really wonderful to be back, quote unquote, local. And there was a lot of content that was squarely in my wheelhouse this time around. There was kind of like an unofficial web components or component track on Saturday that was all in the same room throughout the day. So I just kind of camped out and saw a bunch of great talks and gave one too. I don't know if mine was great, but I gave one.
Clearly, you've been watching the show over the last couple of months, and you've just given Nick an in to talk about web components.
That's funny. Redfin Solutions had a lunch and learn last week, and we were talking about NetCamp last week. And the thing that came up was so many talks on web components and the interest in learning more about that. So you definitely piqued interest of a lot of the attendees of NetCamp, Brian. So thank you, and everybody else who also gave talks in that area and all talks in general.
That's awesome.
All right, let's jump into our primary topic. And Brian, this is something you know a bunch about, so I'm looking forward to learning more throughout the show. Can you tell us, and this is like kind of a broad topic right here. We'll get into more detail, but what is the Drupal State module?
Yeah, it's a general project on Drupal.org that is a node package that's published to NPM. And it's a simple data store to help you manage application state that's sourced from Drupal's JSON API endpoints. So it has a number of utilities that you can use to easily get things from JSON API. And then additionally, when, like, for example, if you were getting all of your articles, it also caches that locally by default. So if you make a second request and you needed a specific article, it wouldn't have to go make a request out to JSON API. It would just get that from the local store. So, a lightweight package that makes it easier to kind of manage that data from JSON API.
Interesting.
Great. Who is involved in the Drupal State module besides yourself, Brian?
Yeah, me, also one of my coworkers at Pantheon, Kobe Cher is one of the maintainers. And then actually one of your coworkers, Leslie, Jay Huskins, has recently come on as a maintainer. He early on was using it and had some suggestions and gave us some nice fixes and has really helped out with the project a lot. So we had him come on as a maintainer.
Excellent. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, that'll be, I believe, his first module that he's helping to maintain. He's very excited about that. So thanks for encouraging him and helping him along.
Yep. Yeah, and then we're also using this package in part of Pantheon's front-end starter kits that we're offering in the Pantheon dashboard. So there's also been, a number of things that have come out of that as far as contributions and interesting applications of the package.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because when I look at the page, there's no release. There's a lot of information. There's actually more information than a lot of modules have on kind of the module page. What is it? I mean, Talking Drupal has a project, quote unquote, on Drupal.org, and that we use that really just to provide credit to guest hosts and hosts and other people that help out on the project. Is that kind of what this is on Drupal.org, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, something that we should probably look at some more. The fact that it doesn't have releases, but and this kind of goes back to some of the efforts around the decoupled menus initiative, which I think there was a previous episode of Talking Drupal that I believe I was on about that. But as an outshoot of the decoupled menus initiative, one thing that came out of that is all of the projects on Drupal.org kind of had the assumption that they were PHP projects in some way.
Yeah.
So whether it's to support things in the kind of Drupal JavaScript ecosystem, or even things that are actually JavaScript packages used by Drupal core, there was the idea of this of a general project. So a project that doesn't necessarily have to be PHP. So this is a general project. And then, how it relates to Drupal and Drupal.org versus NPM. The code is actually hosted on Drupal's GitLab. So the source code is in, Drupal's project instance. The issue queue is managed out of that general project as well, which allows us to credit people who make contributions under Drupal. But the actual project itself is offered via NPM because it's a node package. It makes it a lot easier to distribute. We want visibility on NPM. So yeah, that's why there is no release, because we certainly could tag releases, but I think that actually might make things confusing if we had releases tagged on Drupal.org versus NPM.
So we've hit our first rabbit hole. And I kind of thought we'd go down here. I have a couple questions related to that then. So have you been working with, I know this is something that's been mentioned before, but have you been working with the Drupal Association and the maintainers kind of to figure out how to maintain an NPM project in Drupal? Was this their recommendation, or is this really kind of just ad hoc to try to get visibility on Drupal.org for it?
Yeah, so for Drupal State itself, it was an opportunity to try out that concept of a general project and understand how that would work within Drupal's project ecosystem. The actual creation of the general projects was the team involved with decoupled menus a little bit before I got involved. But I think we're still figuring out the right way that things related to Drupal can be distributed on NPM. And out of the decoupled menus initiative, there are actually technically 2 packages that were developed. The main one being something called decoupled menus parser, which helps parse the output from the new menus endpoint that's going to be in 10.1. And that's something that we actually want to offer under the Drupal namespace on NPM. Currently today, there's only 2 packages under the Drupal namespace on NPM. One is a replacement for jQuery once, and another is an accessible autocomplete. They're both things used by core. So yeah, this particular question, how can we take these 2 new packages, offer them under the Drupal namespace? And that's what we're figuring out. So I've been working with a few of the JavaScript maintainers, and we got some CI in place. They had some feedback on the actual code, and we're discussing things like what is the process if there is a release for this in the future, and things like that. But yeah, I think that some of the answers there are still being decided, but I think it's really important that we have more things under the Drupal namespace on NPM, because I think JavaScript developers look for it. So, defining that process is important.
So I have a couple of questions, not to go further down a rabbit hole, but I just want to try to be a little bit clear about Drupal State and when you would use this, right? So obviously it's being used if you're using JavaScript for your front end. So fair to say that you would only use it on a headless or decoupled solution?
So the package is a utility to get data from Drupal's JSON API endpoints. So any case where you're talking to JSON API, it could make sense. Typically that's decoupled projects, but it's something that can run both on the server and the client side. So if there was some sort of situation where your Drupal site needed to talk to JSON API on the client side, you still could use this. It's definitely not something I consider to be the primary use case, but it's possible.
Got it. So this essentially runs, and we talked about how it comes from NPM, right? And we're going to talk a little bit. I have a question about that specifically in a minute, but so it's basically living with your JavaScript, your JavaScript application, if you will, right? Is that a fair way to put that?
Yeah, it is JavaScript. You certainly could import it as a node dependency and bundle it with your application. There's also been a lot of improvements in JavaScript in general that make it easier to import JavaScript modules. So you could also just import this from a CDN rather than bundling it.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. So going to, this doesn't follow the normal Drupal module kind of output procedures, right? Which we're all pretty familiar with. It's kind of new and uncharted. I guess not uncharted, but it's new territory for the Drupal folks, right? I'm wondering if you saw or had to do anything special to get this NPM package kind of built, and then to be able to release it on NPM or through NPM.
Yeah, for getting it built, the kind of underlying bundler that we're using is something called Vite, which is a project that came out of Vue, but is definitely becoming more popular in the JavaScript ecosystem. So that handles all the bundling, and we've kind of followed their recommendations for general package project setup. As far as publishing it on NPM, it's relatively manual at this point. It's not handled by CI. There's a few like supporting scripts that we have. For something like the packages for the decoupled menus initiative, that's something that, you know, we do want to have that fully automated in CI, and you know, when there's a tagged release, automatically publishing to NPM. But that's where that kind of gets into how to navigate that, you know, because that obviously requires secrets and some additional permissions in GitLab. You know, so how do we coordinate that with the Drupal infrastructure team?
So yeah, because we have that right now for Composer, right? When you create a tagged release on a Drupal module, it's going to release it on the Drupal packagist and push that out. So is the plan, is part of this project working that out so you have the same, so we can, number one, have kind of native Node or JavaScript packages on Drupal.org and have that released? Like, are they planning to release like a Drupal.npm.org or something? I assume that there's private npm repositories, just like there's private packages. Is that what the community and the infrastructure team is working towards, or are you really just like at the drawing board still trying to figure out what the plan is?
Yeah, I would say kind of at the drawing board, to be honest. I do think that those kind of automated tagged releases are important for things that are under the Drupal namespace. And then I think there's a lot of room for improvement for general JavaScript packages. Like, there could be some sort of automated system that could automatically publish or automatically tag releases that show up on your Drupal.org page, or maybe it actually just pulls all of that from NPM, you know, to show what the tagged releases are. I don't think we have a lot of the answers there. And the other thing that I would be hesitant to do is, you know, I don't want to necessarily build a Drupal specific JavaScript solution when maybe our, you know, JavaScript community is like, it's not a big deal to publish this package on NPM. So we actually want to, you know, validate that.
All right, great. You mentioned that this is an offshoot of the decoupled menu initiative. Does it also you know, integrate with the web components, and if so, how does that work?
Yeah, it's in kind of a pretty indirect way an offshoot of the decoupled menus initiative. But so I mentioned that there was an episode on the decoupled menus initiative of Talking Drupal that I was, I believe, the guest host on, and that actually resulted in me following up with the folks that were on the show, Batty and others, and Theodore, and becoming more involved with the initiative. I eventually came on as an initiative coordinator, but out of the show, I was just like, you know, how can I help? How can I keep doing this? And I was interested in web components. So when we did a hackathon around DrupalCon, we wanted to have people in the Drupal community create front-end components that source data from this new menus endpoint. And I worked with a few folks to create a menu web component. And that was kind of the first step into creating that generic Drupal web components project, which is a set of, you know, Drupal-friendly web components. And then when we created the initial menu component, it actually like the component itself talks to Drupal's JSON API, handles managing all the data and everything. And as we looked at doing that with other components, we couldn't really take the same approach. We needed some sort of default or shared way to talk to JSON API and share data across a variety of different components. And something like that didn't really exist at that time. So that is what led me to starting work on the Drupal State project. So pretty, you know, you could say it was all because of Talking Drupal.
We will take credit for that.
Absolutely.
So that makes me wonder, like, is the plan for Drupal State itself to become part of core at some point, or do you think it's going to just stay in contrib and in JavaScript land as kind of like the glue to bind these pieces together?
Yeah, as of right now, I think it would stay in contrib, but kind of getting into some of my dreams for 2023. And I think we are finally starting to see a little community momentum here as the decoupled menus initiative is finally wrapping up. But there are now more clients in addition to Drupal State. that do similar things. There were a few other projects around the time that the Drupal State was created. The Next for Drupal project has since also made their own client available. It depends on React and things like that. But there's now a lot of relatively mature projects that do the very similar things. So what I'm hoping can happen is that we come together and figure out what are the features and utilities in common across all of these projects, and start to take those things and abstract them out into a project and a package that is somehow an official Drupal package. So can you give some specific examples of what problems to solve? Because it sounds like in general, you can just communicate with JSON API, right? And do some of the similar stuff. Yep. So what piece specifically does Drupal State do if I'm looking to build a front end on top of Drupal? Yeah. And you could certainly roll your own for this. And there's a lot of decoupled projects that do this. But, even if you think about just getting, think of the Umami demo data, just getting all of your recipes from JSON API. You have to either know the menu endpoint, or at the root of, not the menu endpoint, the recipes endpoint. But at the root of JSON API, it essentially has an index of all of the different resources that you can access. So if you don't know that endpoint, you have to make a request to the root, figure out what the endpoint is, then use JavaScript fetch or your preferred utility to talk to JSON API, get the response, maybe handle some lightweight error handling, and then make that data available to your application. So it's not the most complicated stuff in the world, but it's also not necessarily things that we need to do over and over. And then if you think beyond just that really simple use case, stuff like authentication and actually saving some sort of cache of that response. So I already got all my recipes and I want my recipe for pudding. I already have that. How do I check to see that I already have that data in my application and return that instead? How do I invalidate that cache? And then also common modules within the Drupal ecosystem we can support. Things like decoupled router, there are utilities for that. So one is, this is just a utility, a client that has a nice developer experience that you can work with without having to lay that groundwork. But then also within that, we've taken care to export and make all of those underlying utilities available. So if somebody didn't want to use the entire Drupal State library, or wanted to use a different solution for managing application state, they could use the individual pieces here to depend on, rather than having to build them themselves.
Okay. And does it provide, so speaking again about the recipes, you said, in the JSON API, you have to go to the root. Does it just provide a new endpoint in Drupal State for getting entities or something? Or how is that abstracted? Or does it let you define, nice, quote unquote, pretty routes or something for that?
Yeah. So, at the risk of mouth programming here, how that works is, so you create an instance of the store that's essentially an instance of Drupal State, and then there's a get object method, for example, that lets you get any object from JSON API. So you could say get object node -- recipes, and what Drupal State does behind the scenes is it goes, all right, I need node recipes. I'm going to check the index of JSON API. And it will also cache that locally so that request only needs to be made once. And then it's going to say, oh, I see that the recipes, node recipes endpoint is this URL. I'm going to make a request to that URL, authenticate if I'm supposed to. I'm going to get all the results back. And then it will, in that same data store, it will store, key data for all of the recipes as well.
Got it.
So this might be a dumb question, and I apologize if it is. But in listening, especially in the example you just gave, I'm wondering how this is different from something like GraphQL, right? So like as I understand it in probably the most simplest terms, GraphQL, right, it gives you the ability to kind of like simplify your API and make it more accessible to folks, right? It kind of sounds like that's what Drupal State is doing for Drupal folks, right? And that was very clear to me in the great example you just gave, where I'm like, okay, I've written this quote unquote command, and now it's going to get recipes from the database based on JSON endpoints.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's, you know, it's certainly not on the scale of GraphQL and the you know, amount of control and the shape of the query that you get from GraphQL. But yeah, it really is trying to improve the developer experience talking to JSON API. And, you know, specifically from the perspective of people who might not be familiar with the JSON API spec or Drupal's implementation of it. So it also, by default, the response that it gets back is deserialized and flattened. So there's a lot less you have to do to dig into Drupal specifics or referenced entities or Drupal's kind of attributes object. The data is primarily just more on the top level there.
Now that's
so yeah, make it easier.
That's an interesting point. So like if I had, you know, going back to the recipe example, right? If I had like an ingredient entity reference, right? Would Drupal State then pull the entity reference information as well? So like, hey, give me a list of recipes. Okay, here's a list of recipes. And then here's the, you know, the sugar ingredient and, you know, its name and the kind of the information that is associated with that node.
Yeah, there's a way to pass parameters. So any parameters that you can use with JSON API can be used. And we actually, the library uses another package that is also commonly used in the Drupal decoupled ecosystem, which is Drupal JSON API parameters, I believe. And that just provides an API interface to be able to create, you know, include parameters, sorting parameters, all the things that JSON API lets you do. So it just makes that a little bit easier. And talking about also GraphQL and like trying to make this stuff easier for developers, we have, in working on this project, we were trying to find, you know, how far do we go in trying to make this easy and even like GraphQL-like? And we did have an experimental feature that we've since deprecated, but there actually is a package, an NPM package that allows you to write lightweight GraphQL queries against JSON API. And with that, we were able to do some things like automatically add, you know, the necessary include parameters and things like that. And it was nice, but I think there was just kind of a little too much magic, and it resulted in us having to kind of worry about two different query paths, which is why we deprecated it. But
so
okay.
Are you using this on any live sites right now, or is this kind of theory craft still?
Yep, it's definitely being used on live sites. I think part of the reason that Jay at Redfin became more involved is because I believe they're using it on at least one client project. It's part of the starter kits that Pantheon is offering in their dashboard for the front-end sites product. So if you spin up a Next.js starter kit with Drupal, it uses this. So yeah, there's definitely production use out in the wild. You know, certainly more to come, and you know, more for this this package to grow. But
Great. So, Brian, you've talked a real lot. There's a lot that you and the other maintainers have done on this on this project. There's a lot that you have talked about today in terms of I'm overwhelmed with all the things you talked about. It could do and it might do. So, what's on the roadmap for the immediate future for the project?
yeah, there's some things that you know, we've had issues for that we haven't been able to get to. You know, a common one is right now the utilities that we offer are read only. So being able to also have similar helpers for all of the other update, delete, you know, create operations that JSON API can do. There's some enhancements related to our locale handling that we'd like to do. Improvements to like our TypeScript types. But as I kind of alluded to before, the thing that I would really love to see, those involved with this project and other similar projects to focus on in 2023 is, trying to figure out what are all the common elements among these clients and how can we, essentially contribute that to Drupal in an official capacity. And I'd love a world where, Drupal State continues in Contrib, but uses those utilities for things like, fetching from JSON API and, whatever we decide is like things that should be abstracted. And even if there was a situation where that gains enough momentum that like it makes more sense for us to have like an official Drupal JSON API client, I'd certainly be fine with that too.
It's interesting. A couple of times as you've been talking about this, and just as you were talking about that goal for 2023 or that wish for 2023, maybe, it becomes clear to me that this is very much a utility or a helper thing, right? And I'm wondering, like, is this something that could someday maybe not be in Drupal core, but maybe be included with something like Drush? Like, is that something that could happen, or is it just not possible because of kind of the makeup of Drush and where Drush is typically used?
Yeah, I see this more as something that would be under the @Drupal namespace on NPM.
Okay.
Which I kind of, and as we talked about, I think we're figuring out all the parameters around this, but like, I think of that as kind of like Drupal core for JavaScript at this point. As far as like, things that are not actually shipped with Drupal core, official Drupal right. JavaScript projects and dependencies.
Yep.
And I also think that it's important that Drupal has more of a presence on NPM. Because right now we only have 2 packages. I think the more official Drupal utilities we offer, I think it's what JavaScript developers expect, but also it, hopefully makes it clear that we, have a JavaScript ecosystem and are serious about this decoupled Drupal use case.
Yeah, interesting, because that's the other thing. I'm hearing that you're saying that like, hey, this does not. This isn't in Drupal core, right? It's its own module and whatnot, which makes sense for the time being. But I also see it being something that could be very useful in Drupal core, or as you just said, in like a base Drupal JS framework of sorts, right? Kind of that like starting place for folks who are looking to build a JS front end for their Drupal site.
Yep. Yeah, and something that I think Dries mentioned in the DrupalCon Europe keynote this year was, thinking past Drupal 10 and where we might be able to move forward and accelerate, like the idea of there being some sort of official Drupal decoupled reference implementation. And something like this, I think, ideally would serve that really nicely.
Interesting. So if somebody is listening and wants to get involved, because talking Drupal clearly makes these things happen, as you've highlighted, how would somebody
brings people together?
Exactly. That's the main goal. How would somebody get involved? Where should they start, basically, if they want to be involved?
Yeah, there are a couple of different places. There's a couple of channels in the Drupal Slack. There actually is a Drupal State channel in Drupal Slack. There also is the Decoupled Menus Initiative channel that I would expect to be winding down, but there still are ongoing discussions about kind of what's next out of that initiative. And that's where there's been some discussion about the like official Drupal utilities or official Drupal client has been going on. And then also the issue queue for the project on Drupal.org. So Drupal_state. Feel free to submit issues there and try it out.
I have a question for you about the front end. So my understanding is that Redfin is using it on a production site that's using Svelte. And that's how Jay got into, looking into the Drupal State project and getting involved with it. So yes, we know it works with Svelte. Does it work better for a specific front end, React or Vue or something, or is it agnostic in terms of the JavaScript framework used?
Yeah, it is intentionally agnostic. And that's definitely been my focus with a lot of these projects. There's definitely a lot of momentum around React and a lot of great things in the React ecosystem, but I think it's important for Drupal and Drupal's JavaScript ecosystem to be able to serve all of the different frameworks. So Drupal State is just vanilla JavaScript at the end of the day. So you can use it with React, Svelte, Vue, whatever thing is cool in 5 years.
In 6 months, you mean?
Yeah. Actually, the new framework dropped just now.
So the other thing that I always think about with these types of kind of glue modules or glue utilities, rather, is, contrib ecosystems. For example, if I'm thinking specifically about commerce, right? The commerce system is really in depth, really broad. Do you have to do something specific on the Drupal State end in order to integrate with that? Or is it kind of like, as long as the module integrates with JSON API, Drupal State will work?
Yeah, it's basically as long as it works in a traditional way with JSON API, Drupal State will work. The one potential hiccup I've seen there is it's easier for Drupal State to pick up on this stuff if it's part of that main root API index. Okay. So some modules don't implement that. There is a module called JSON API Hypermedia, I believe, which will register a JSON API endpoint under that root index. But basically, if your JSON API endpoint, even if it's a custom endpoint, is part of that index, it's off to the races.
Oh,
but yeah, I could see a situation where we have we could have additional helper utilities for specific use cases, but at the end of the day, yeah, generically this is like an easy way to talk to JSON API, whatever JSON API spits out.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of this project becomes like documentation, like kind of maybe a side initiative of it, a side initiative of the side initiative, is documenting. Like, if you implement JSON API this way, it will work. If you do it this way, like the common pitfall type thing, like don't do this when you're doing it, do this, and then we'll work with it automatically. Because I can see, if you make the integration as low effort for module developers, that just makes their stuff available for you, which makes it available for decoupled sites automatically.
Yep.
Or as
that makes
automatic
sense.
as it can be.
I was going to say, we do have docs for the project that are hosted on GitLab pages. So there is some stuff like that up there, but yeah, definitely ways we could expand it.
So I have a little bit of a broader question about JS frameworks. Leslie mentioned Svelte. I personally am working on a project that's using React. I believe Nick's web components are mostly in React, if I'm not misspeaking there.
Misspeaking. They're native. They're just native JavaScript web components.
Okay.
Framework. Yeah.
They're not using a framework, so he's not using a framework. But if he did have to use a framework, Brian Perry, how would you evaluate a JS framework, and what are some tips or tricks you can provide to our audience to help in their JavaScript framework evaluations?
Yeah, that is potentially a topic that could serve its own entire podcast. But yeah, some things that come to mind. With a lot of the newer frameworks, there's kind of an emerging focus on like either hybrid or kind of server first approaches to JavaScript frameworks. So I think understanding your needs as far as what needs to be dynamic, what needs to be server rendered, or what can be cached and static. Having a good understanding of that can help you evaluate the frameworks. So if it's something that could be a static deployment, there's one set of frameworks that you might want to look at. If you are on the complete other side where you need to server render everything, there's another set of frameworks that would serve your needs there. Then looking at the ecosystem in general for a framework, what other tools exist out there? Are there existing agreed upon solutions for the things I want to do? And there's the kind of Drupal sub aspect of that. Like, are there things in the Drupal ecosystem that support that? React and also Next.js really does seem to be gaining large momentum and market share there.
Okay.
And there definitely is a lot in the Next.js Drupal ecosystem. There's the Next.js for Drupal projects from Chapter 3, which is really successful and well-maintained. And then also understanding the needs of your team or the skill set of your team. So, if you have a bunch of Svelte developers, React probably isn't the right solution. So if there is an existing skill set there, that can help with the decision. And then another thing, this is probably colored a little bit by some of the work that I do at Pantheon, but do you have any specific hosting needs, or if you're evaluating these frameworks generally, are any of the features that they're talking about things that are specific to one certain hosting provider?
Sure.
Yeah.
For example, one example that comes to mind is, some of the features that Gatsby offers are, make some assumptions about Gatsby Cloud. But there's, certainly a lot of things that Gatsby offers that's fully open source too.
Okay.
One of the interesting things, I think you said a lot of interesting things there, but I think one of the things that somebody may not necessarily think about when selecting a framework is the support within the Drupal community. Obviously, the project I'm working on is actually using Next.js. So there's pretty good support, actually excellent support for that. But new JS framework to be named later, right, comes out and there isn't a ton of Drupal support. You may be kind of forging your own path there, which is definitely, in my opinion, a big decision that you need to make.
Yep.
So I've got one final question before we close out the show. And we've kind of hinted at this throughout the show, but I figured I'd make the question explicit. What's the kind of stability of the Drupal State project? Is it fully stable, no major changes, just new features moving forward? Or is it still, somewhat in flux? You're still trying to work out some kinks and figure out exactly how best to serve the Drupal community? From what I understand, it sounds stable, but I like that confirmation.
Yeah, we do treat the project, we consider the project stable and follow semantic versioning from that perspective. So we have had situations where we did consider it important to make a breaking change. But in that case, we communicate that and also have a major version release as a result of that.
Well, Brian, it's been great having you back on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Yeah, this was fun. Do
you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and our listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. So, Brian, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions or want to get involved in Drupal State, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at BRI Comedy. Who knows what state Twitter will be in by the time this episode releases, but that's one place. I'm Brian Perry on Drupal.org, and I'm on the various Drupal Slacks as well.
And Leslie, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
Sure. So I'm Leslie G on Drupal.org, and I'm also Leslie Glynn on Twitter.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me online at NixFan, NSCXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys next week.